The auction barn smelled of dust, hay, and despair. Voices rose above the creak of wooden benches, a chorus of laughter, bargains, and careless wagers. Horses were paraded out one after another, their hooves clattering against the worn floorboards as men shouted bids with quick, hungry gestures. Each animal was weighed in the balance of worth, sold off like old tools at a yard sale. Amid the noise and the heat, a single horse stood apart. His ribs pushed sharply against his skin. His coat was dull, scarred, and crawling with neglect. His head hung so low it seemed to pull his whole body downward, as though gravity itself had decided he wasn't worth lifting. The auctioneer's voice cut through the chatter. "And here we got ourselves a fine one, folks," he said, but the sarcasm dripped from his tongue like bitter oil. The crowd chuckled. Barely skin and bones, but hey, maybe someone's got a use for a scarecrow on 4 legs. He smacked his gavel against the block. "Who'll give me $5? No. 3. Don't be shy. It's cheaper than a sack of feed." No hands went up. The silence that followed was crueler than laughter. The horse shifted his weight, his knees trembling under the strain. His ears flicked at the noise, but there was no spark of life in his eyes, only the dull glaze of one who had long ago stopped expecting kindness. The auctioneer grinned wickedly. "All right then, let's make history. Who'll take him for a single dollar? Come on now, $1. Less than a cup of coffee. Anyone? Or do we just throw him out back and be done with it?" The audience erupted in jeers and chuckles. Someone shouted, "I've seen better-looking bones in a soup pot." Another added, "He ain't worth the rope tied to his neck." At the edge of the crowd stood a man who had no business being there. His clothes were worn, sleeves rolled up to hide the frayed cuffs. A faded cap shadowed his face, but the lines etched into his skin told a story of hard years, of disappointments stacked like stones. He hadn't come to buy. Truth be told, he had come only because he didn't know where else to go, wandering into the auction barn like a stray searching for shelter. Yet when his eyes found the horse, something shifted. He saw not just the bones, not just the wasted frame. He saw the quiet, desperate defiance buried deep in that hollow stare. It was the same look he had seen in his own reflection too many times. The look of someone who had been cast aside and forgotten, but still breathed, still endured. The auctioneer was about to slam the gavel down and dismiss the animal to the pens behind the barn when, almost without realizing it, the man's hand rose. It was a small motion, barely above his waist, but it stopped the room cold. $1, the auctioneer said, grinning broadly now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves a buyer." He brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed in the rafters. "Sold. To the gentleman who just bought himself a walking miracle, or maybe just more trouble than he can handle." The crowd roared with laughter, but the man didn't hear them. He was already moving, weaving through the benches until he stood before the trembling horse. Up close, the animal looked worse than he had from afar. His hide bore the scars of ill treatment, his breathing was shallow, and his eyes, those haunted eyes, flicked nervously as though bracing for the next blow. The auction handler shoved the lead rope into the man's hand. "He's all yours," the handler said with a smirk, as if passing on a curse. The man tightened his grip. The rope felt rough in his palm, but it was more than rope now. It was a thread binding 2 lives together. The horse resisted, jerking back, nostrils flaring. For a moment it seemed as though he might collapse right there, unable to muster the strength to step forward. "Easy," the man whispered, his voice low, steady. He didn't pull, didn't force. He simply waited. The horse's ears twitched at the sound, and after a long pause, he took one hesitant step, then another. The crowd jeered behind them, but the sound faded as the pair moved toward the sunlight spilling through the open doors. The man led the horse across the dirt lot, each step slow, deliberate. With every pace, he felt the weight of his decision pressing harder. He could barely keep food on his own table. His farm, what was left of it, was nothing more than a patch of worn soil and a barn that leaked more rain than it kept out. He couldn't explain why he had raised his hand, why he had risked even a single dollar he couldn't afford to lose. But as he looked at the fragile creature beside him, he knew. Because someone had to. Because if he didn't, No one else would. The horse stumbled, nearly falling, and the man caught him with a steadying hand against his flank. The touch was brief, yet electric. For the first time, the horse didn't recoil. He only stood there, breathing hard, his weight leaning ever so slightly into the man's palm. A lump formed in the man's throat. He swallowed hard, fighting back emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He knew rejection. He knew what it was to be cast aside, unwanted, worthless in the eyes of others. And now, somehow, he and this broken animal were tied together, both of them survivors of a world that had turned its back on them. He took a deep breath and straightened, adjusting the rope. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "We've got a long road ahead." The horse flicked an ear, as if listening. His steps were clumsy, but he followed. Behind them, the auctioneer's voice carried faintly. "Can't believe anyone paid even $1 for that wreck." The man didn't turn back. The laughter, the jeers, the disbelief, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the trembling weight beside him, the fragile life he had chosen to protect. The setting sun threw long shadows across the ground as they walked away from the barn. The man's chest ached with uncertainty, with the burden of what he had just taken on. But there was also something else, a spark, faint and fragile, but alive. For just $1, he had bought a horse the world had rejected. And in that same moment, though he didn't yet know it, he had also bought a chance at saving himself. The road home stretched long and uneven, a ribbon of dirt that wound between fields browned by drought and fences leaning with age. The man walked slowly, steadying the horse beside him. Each step was cautious, as though the animal feared the earth might give way beneath his hooves. The man could feel the tremor in the rope, the hesitation in every movement, but he didn't hurry him. Patience, he thought. Patience was the only thing he had left to give. By the time they reached the farm, the sun had dipped low, setting the sky aflame with streaks of orange and violet. The barn loomed in silhouette, its roof patched with tin that rattled in the wind. Weeds crowded the fence line, and the gate groaned as he pushed it open. He led the horse inside, where the smell of old wood and hay greeted them like a memory from another life. The horse stopped in the doorway, nostrils flaring. He was weary, but suspicion still lingered in his eyes. The man loosened the rope and let it fall slack, giving him the freedom to choose. After a tense pause, the horse stepped inside. The hollow sound of his hooves echoed in the rafters, and the man felt a small relief stir in his chest. He found an old pail, filled it with water from the pump, and slid it gently toward the horse. The animal sniffed, then turned his head away. The man set out a measure of grain, but the horse only stared at it, ears flicking back nervously. Hunger gnawed at him. His ribs told the story well enough, but fear was stronger. The man crouched nearby, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't try to coax or force. Instead, he simply sat, watching in silence, his breathing slow and even. The barn filled with the quiet sounds of evening, the creak of wood, the rustle of mice in the straw, the distant call of a night bird. After a long while, the horse lowered his head and took one mouthful, then another. The man didn't move, though a swell of emotion rose inside him. The first wall had cracked. That night, he lay on a cot in the corner of the barn, listening to the horse's uneasy shifting. Sleep came in fragments. Memories returned unbidden. The cold stares of people who had turned him away when he'd needed help. The weight of loss that had hollowed his chest. He knew what it meant to be unwanted, to feel like nothing more than a burden. And he wondered if that was why he had lifted his hand at the auction, why he had spent the $1 he could ill afford. Perhaps he had seen himself in the animal's eyes. Days passed in slow rhythm. Each morning, he carried water and feed, always placing them near, but never pushing them closer than the horse was ready for. Sometimes the food went untouched until nightfall. Sometimes it was gone by dawn. He repaired the broken slats of the stall, patched leaks in the roof, and laid down fresh straw. With each repair, with every act of care, he felt a strange sense of purpose stir within him again, fragile but persistent. The horse began to watch him more closely. His ears followed the man's movements, and though he shied at sudden noises, he no longer pressed himself against the far wall. The man spoke to him in low tones, not words meant to instruct, but words meant to soothe, Snippets of memory, fragments of thought. He told him about long winters and lost summers, about hopes that had turned brittle, about silence that had grown too heavy to bear. The horse could not understand the words, but he seemed to understand the sound, the steadiness of the voice that never rose in anger. One evening, as the sun slanted gold across the fields, the man carried a brush into the stall. The horse flinched at the sight of it, eyes wide, muscles tensing as if expecting pain. The man paused, then set the brush down within reach, lowering himself to the straw. He waited. Minutes passed. The horse sniffed the tool, then backed away, uncertain. The man didn't move. He only stayed there, quiet, patient. At last, curiosity won. The horse stepped closer, his breath stirring the man's sleeve. Slowly, carefully, the man lifted the brush and ran it once along the animal's shoulder. The horse stiffened, but when no pain came, he stood still. Another stroke, and another. Dust and loose hair rose into the air. The man's hand trembled as he worked, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. For the first time, the barrier between them had truly broken. Yet trust was fragile. A storm rolled in one night, thunder shaking the barn, rain hammering against the roof. Lightning split the sky, and the horse panicked, rearing and striking against the stall. The man rushed to calm him, speaking softly, but the animal's terror was wild, uncontrollable. A flailing hoof missed his shoulder by inches, and he stumbled back, breath caught in his throat. He could have run, could have left the horse to his fear, but instead he sank down into the straw, arms open, voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Minutes dragged like hours, the storm raging above them. Slowly, the horse's frenzy ebbed. His breaths came harsh, his sides heaving, until at last he lowered his head. He stepped forward, trembling, and in a moment that felt almost unreal, he pressed his forehead against the man's shoulder. Rain dripped through the roof, soaking them both, but neither moved. In that fragile silence, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a fragile thread of trust tied fast. When dawn came, the storm had gone, leaving the earth washed clean. The man rose stiffly from the straw, exhaustion heavy in his bones, but when he looked at the horse, standing calm and watchful now, he felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. That morning, as he walked out into the yard, he noticed neighbors leaning on the fence, watching. Their smirks carried the same disbelief as before. "Waste of time," one of them muttered. "That thing won't last a week." The man didn't answer. He only turned back toward the barn, where the horse's shadow moved in the light, fragile yet steady. Inside, he found the animal waiting, ears forward, eyes cautious but no longer empty. For the first time, the man allowed himself a smile. The road ahead would be long, harder than either of them yet knew, but a step had been taken, and that was enough to keep him moving. The days folded into weeks, and slowly the broken shape of the horse began to change. Flesh filled out along his ribs, his coat gained a muted sheen, and his eyes, once dulled by despair, started to catch the light again. He still bore the marks of neglect, scars that time could never erase, but the man had learned not to see him through the eyes of the crowd. He no longer looked at a ruin. He looked at possibility. Every morning began with the same ritual. The man would bring water and feed, speaking in that low, steady voice, and the horse would watch him, waiting, no longer recoiling. A soft nicker had even begun to escape the animal's throat when the man approached, a sound that carried like music in the quiet barn. With patience and repetition, he introduced simple tasks, walking the horse along the fence line, leading him across uneven ground, teaching him to trust the pressure of the rope instead of fighting it. At first the horse balked, hooves digging stubbornly into the earth, but the man never raised his voice, never forced. He coaxed with calm persistence until, step by step, the horse followed. There were small victories. The first time the horse allowed the halter to be slipped on without a flinch. The first time he trotted beside the man, clumsy but willing. The first time he lowered his head to accept a gentle pat instead of pulling away. Each moment was a milestone, fragile and precious, and the man carried them like treasures. The neighbors noticed too, though not kindly. One evening, leaning against the fence, A man spat into the dirt and called out, "Looks like you're trying to polish a stone into gold. He ain't got the bloodline or the build. You'll feed him till you're broke, and for what?" Another added, "That nag's just a shadow. You'd be better off letting him go." The man didn't argue. He had no interest in convincing them. Words meant nothing to those who had already made up their minds. Instead, he returned to the barn and brushed the horse's coat until it gleamed faintly under the lamplight, whispering, "They don't have to see it. You and I know it's there." One afternoon, while mending a section of fence, the man overheard talk from the passing road. There was to be a county fair in 2 months' time, complete with contests of strength and skill. Horses from all around would compete, pulling weighted sleds, running timed courses, carrying their riders in displays of speed and control. The news settled into his thoughts like a seed. He didn't speak it aloud, not even to himself at first, but a quiet idea took root. Perhaps the horse could stand in that arena, not to prove himself to others, but to prove to both of them that broken things could rise again. The training shifted. The walks became longer, the terrain more varied. The man guided the horse across shallow streams, through tall grass, around the edge of the plowed fields. At times the horse stumbled, his muscles still weak, but always he rose again, breathing hard, eyes fixed on the man's steady figure at his side. The man found his own strength returning as well. The labor that once felt heavy now carried purpose. Each bead of sweat was an offering, each calloused blister a mark of devotion to the path they were walking together. At dusk, he sometimes sat against the barn wall, watching the horse graze in the fading light. He would remember the laughter from the auction, the cruel voices dismissing the animal as worthless. That memory no longer filled him with shame, but with determination. They had laughed at him, too, once. They had turned their backs when he had faltered, but the bond he was building here was a quiet defiance against all of it. Still, not everything came easy. The first time he placed a light saddle on the horse's back, the animal tensed violently, kicking against the stall, eyes rolling white with panic. The man removed it at once, stroking his neck, murmuring reassurance. Days later he tried again, slower this time, showing the horse each strap, letting him sniff the leather, brushing him gently before setting the weight across his spine. Bit by bit, the fear ebbed. The horse allowed the saddle to rest without lashing out, though his body quivered under the pressure. The man didn't press further. Trust had to be earned in layers, not seized in a single act. As weeks passed, the horse's stride grew stronger, his movements steadier. On a crisp morning, the man led him out into the field, unhooked the rope, and stepped back. For a moment, the horse stood uncertain, ears flicking, eyes darting to the man for guidance. Then, with a sudden burst, he galloped across the field. His mane flew wild, his hooves thundered against the earth, and the man felt a surge in his chest, half pride, half awe. He hadn't seen the horse move with such freedom before. It was as though the weight of years had fallen away, and for the first time the animal remembered he was meant to run. When he returned, sweat darkening his coat, the horse came straight to the man, head lowered, sides heaving. The man pressed his hand against the warm neck, whispering, "That's it, boy. That's the spirit they said you didn't have." But doubt lingered in the corners of the man's mind. Could a horse, once deemed worthless truly, stand among others at the fair? Could he, a man beaten down by his own failures, dare to believe in something so bold? At night, lying awake in the barn, he wrestled with those questions. The horse's quiet breathing nearby was the only answer he had, steady and grounding, urging him forward even when reason faltered. One evening, as he forte into the stall, an older neighbor stopped at the gate. Unlike the others, this man's tone held no mockery. "You're thinking about that fair, aren't you?" he asked. The man stiffened, caught off guard, but said nothing. The neighbor nodded toward the horse. "If you're going to do it, you'll need more than hope. You'll need discipline, and he'll need you steady every step." The words lingered long after the neighbor walked away. Discipline, steadiness. He had known failure before, had been broken by it, but this time was different. He wasn't alone in the struggle. He had a partner, one who carried his own scars, one who had every reason to give up but hadn't. The next morning, He stood before the horse with renewed resolve. "We've come this far," he whispered. "Maybe it's time we show them all what $1 can buy." The horse flicked his ears, eyes bright in the rising sun, and though no words passed between them, the man felt the answer in his bones. The journey toward the fair had begun, and neither of them would turn back. The sun dipped low over the valley, streaking the sky with shades of crimson and gold, and casting long shadows over the open field. Daniel tightened the reins, his heart thudding in rhythm with the hooves beneath him. What had begun as an impossible dream was now unfolding before the gathered crowd. The rejected horse, his horse, was about to face the world that had once deemed him worthless. This was not just a test of skill. It was the final reckoning of trust, faith, and second chances. The crowd's murmur swelled into a hum of anticipation. Farmers, ranchers, and curious townsfolk leaned against the railings, some with arms folded skeptically, others whispering in hushed awe. They remembered this horse, skinny, broken, a pitiful creature sold for $1. And now, under the fading light, he gleamed with strength, his coat shimmering like brushed bronze, his frame carrying the proud tension of untapped power. Daniel could feel every muscle shifting beneath him, every breath filled with a resolve that mirrored his own. The test was simple in words but perilous in execution, a challenging course of jumps, tight turns, and obstacles designed to push even the most well-trained horses to their limits. For Daniel and his companion, it was more than a competition. It was proof to themselves and to the world that rejection did not define them, that broken things could be remade into something extraordinary. The horn sounded. The first gate opened. The horse surged forward, and the ground seemed to quake beneath the thunder of his stride. Daniel leaned low, guiding him with a gentle press of his legs. The first hurdle rose ahead, a tall, daunting fence of painted wood. Gasps rippled through the audience, many expecting hesitation, failure, even disaster. But the horse lifted effortlessly, soaring over with grace that silenced the doubts. His hooves touched earth as light as whispers, and Daniel could not help but smile. This was not the same creature he had led away from the auction yard. This was a miracle in motion. Obstacle after obstacle fell behind them. Each turn tested balance. Each leap tested courage. But together they moved as if tied by an invisible thread of understanding. Daniel gave no harsh commands, he asked, and the horse answered, carrying him not out of fear, but trust. And that trust, earned through sleepless nights and patient hands, shone brighter than any trophy or prize. Halfway through, the challenge grew harsher. A water jump sprawled before them, its surface reflecting the fiery sky. The crowd leaned in, holding their breath. Many horses balked at water, and Daniel knew the scars of the past still lingered in his companion's mind. He could feel the horse hesitate, muscles tightening as memories of pain and rejection flickered within. Daniel whispered softly, almost inaudibly, "You're not alone anymore. We can do this, together." The horse snorted, ears flicking back, and then with a powerful bound, he launched forward. Water sprayed high into the air as they cleared the jump, droplets catching the sunset and scattering like jewels. The crowd erupted, cheers breaking the tension like thunder, and Daniel felt it deep in his chest, the unshakable certainty that this bond was not forged in luck, but in resilience, in unwavering faith against all odds. The final stretch loomed ahead, marked by the tallest barrier on the course. It was deliberately intimidating, designed to humble even champions. Daniel steadied his breath, knowing that this was the true test. Failure here would mean a stumble back into the shadows of doubt. Success would mean undeniable redemption. The horse's hooves pounded closer, his body coiled like a spring. Daniel leaned forward, heart and soul entwined in the moment. Time seemed to stretch, each stride echoing louder, each second carrying the weight of their shared journey. Then, with a surge that felt like flight itself, the horse lifted, soaring higher than seemed possible. For an instant, suspended in air, they defied gravity and history alike. When they landed, strong and flawless, the field exploded in applause. Shouts of disbelief, joy, and admiration rang out, echoing into the night. Men who had once mocked, women who had once pitied, and children who had once turned away, all stood in stunned silence before clapping until their palms stung. Daniel slid from the saddle, his legs trembling but his spirit soaring. He pressed his forehead against the horse's neck, breathing in the scent of sweat and dust, and whispered, "You've done it. We've done it." The announcer's voice rang across the grounds, declaring them victors, not just of the course, but of something greater, something immeasurable. Yet Daniel barely heard the words. His triumph was not in the prize, but in the journey that brought him here. The sleepless nights spent nursing wounds, the endless days teaching trust, the quiet moments where despair nearly won, but hope held firm. Reporters surged forward. Townsfolk clamored with questions. But Daniel shielded the horse from the chaos, guiding him gently toward the quiet edge of the field. Away from the noise, he looked into those deep, dark eyes, once clouded with pain, now alight with pride, and felt tears sting his own. This was not just a horse. This was a companion, a healer of broken hearts, a living testament that even what the world discards can rise again. As twilight settled, painting the horizon in indigo and silver, Daniel and the horse stood together, silhouetted against the fading light. Around them, the echoes of cheers faded into memory, but within them, the bond remained unshakable. They had faced rejection, endured suffering, and together, they had rewritten their destiny. Daniel knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, for life was never without storms. But he also knew that storms no longer frightened him, not with this horse by his side. They had weathered worse and emerged unbroken. He ran a hand through the horse's mane and smiled faintly, whispering the words that had carried them both through despair. Second chances aren't given, they're earned. And as stars began to pierce the darkening sky, he felt an overwhelming peace settle over him. The miracle was not the victory, nor the applause, nor even the transformation. The miracle was the bond itself, forged in pain, strengthened in trust, and crowned in love. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day. Stories of resilience, hope, and the miracles born when we dare to believe in second chances.